Hey everyone, welcome to the show where we discuss current legal events and legal hot topics from the perspective of a seasoned attorney such as myself. And so today we are going to be discussing the status of our democracy in the United States. And so as you can see, the question is whether our democracy is in danger. And unless you've been living under a rock, you have probably heard political pundits and other legal professionals discussing this topic and expressing concern that our democracy is in danger. What does that mean? And then, in order to figure that out, we're going to walk through this process of analyzing a democratic framework and how democratic frameworks deteriorate. To do that, we are going to be using the ancient Greek philosophers' theory on democracy. So, in layman's terms, there's a few factors that I have plucked out of Aristotle's theory. There's a lot of factors. I think that I have 12 actually listed in this podcast. There's quite a few more than that, but for the sake of brevity, I've taken 12 factors and analyzing our current legal climate using those factors. Okay, so from a housekeeping perspective, this segment could get pretty long because we have to first understand what is democracy, the legal definition of democracy. Then we need to understand the framework of democracy. In order to do that, we look at the four main criteria of modern democracies. And then we're going to look at if a democracy is deteriorating, what does it deteriorate into? And then we have to look at the framework and criteria for that. And so because there's so much material before we can even get to Aristotle's factors, I have separated this segment into two parts. So for the first part, which we're going to be going through today, we're simply going to be discussing what democracy means and how it functions. And then we're also going to look at the most common type of government that will follow a democracy, such as the one that we have in the United States, and that is what is called an authoritarian government. With that being said, let's go ahead and start looking at our first factor. So according to Black's Law Dictionary, a democracy is a type of government by the people, and it'll be either direct or indirect. And just so you know, an indirect democracy is the type of democracy we have here in the United States. That means that the people will elect representatives who will then actually run the government. So in a democracy, everyone is considered equal and has the right to vote and therefore make decisions. So the hallmark of a democracy is that everyone gets to make decisions. That's why it's so important that everyone utilize their right to vote. But even more importantly than just simply going out and voting and checking a box is actually understanding the impact of the decision that you are making when you actually elect someone to represent you. When we vote, we are voting for people who we think are going to represent our interests, not just our beliefs, but our entire interest, all of our civil rights, all of our political rights, and all of our civil liberties. That's why it's so important that we understand what we stand for, and so that we can vote not just for a cause. Some people vote on causes. Oh, I believe in this. I'm for environmental laws, and this particular group is environmentally friendly, so I only vote for them. No, that's a cause. We vote on policies. Clauses do not compel governments to run effectively. Policies compel governments to run effectively. So when we vote, we need to understand the policy platforms, that's what we refer to them as, the policy platforms of the people that we are voting for. So I don't have time to get into policy platforms, but if that's something that you're interested in, stay tuned because I am going to be creating a video on how do you identify policy platforms. Okay, let's go ahead and move along to looking at the framework for modern democracies. So there are 4 criteria of modern democratic governments. So the first criteria is that the executive and legislatures are chosen through elections that are open, free, and fair. And so in the United States, the executive branch includes the president and his cabinet, and his cabinet includes the vice president and the head of the 15 different administrative agencies. For example, the Treasury is an administrative agency, which the IRS is part of the Treasury. There's the Department of Labor, there's the Department of Education, the Department of Health and Human Services, just to name a few. So our federal legislature is referred to as Congress, and then each individual state has its own legislature, okay? And so again, the executive and both the federal and state legislatures have to be chosen through elections that are open, free, and fair. And so just as a caveat, we know that the administrative agencies, they are not chosen through elections. They are simply the president's executive office. So it's like a CEO, and then that CEO has other chief executives, and then they have executive vice presidents. It's a similar type of system, okay? And so then, now the second criteria is that virtually all adults possess the right to vote. And so now in the United States, all adults initially have the right to vote. It's simply that some adults will lose their right to vote. There's limited circumstances when this happens, but the most common circumstance is when someone is convicted of certain crimes. Now, the third criteria is that political rights and civil liberties are broadly protected. And so I do want to just discuss very quickly what is a political right and what is a civil liberty. Now, according to Black's Law Dictionary, a political right is the right to participate in the establishment or administration of the government. And so an example of that is the right to vote. And then now a civil liberty is what most lay people will refer to as a right. So when people say things like, I know my rights, what they're really referring to is a civil liberty. And so according to Black's Law Dictionary, a civil liberty is freedom from undue governmental interference or restraint, especially the right of all citizens to be free to do as they please. And now here's the catch and the most important part of this statement, while respecting the rights of others. And if you saw my episode on the separation of church and state, I mentioned in that episode that our rights have boundaries. And this is what I meant. Our civil liberties have boundaries. The boundaries kick in when the exercise or expression of a person's individual civil liberties begin to oppress and repress the exercise of other people's civil liberties. So just keep that in mind, because that's something we're going to see a lot throughout these different episodes. Also, and I should say lastly, the last criteria of modern democratic governments is that elected authorities possess real authority to govern. So in some types of governments, even though representatives may actually be elected by the people, those elected representatives don't actually have any real power to make laws or to influence how the government is run. That's what we refer to as tutelary control. And the most common time that that'll be done is through military might. For example, that might occur in a dictatorship or in a tyranny. Next, we are going to discuss the authoritarian type of government. And so I do have a definition here. Now, notice that this definition comes from the Encyclopedia Britannica, and that is because I have the most recent edition of Black's Law Dictionary, and I also have the very large unabridged version. However, the term authoritarian was not actually defined in Black's Law Dictionary. And now the fact that the term was not defined in Black's Law Dictionary does not mean that this is not a legitimate term or that it's not a true type of government. Because an authoritarian type of government is a political system that concentrates power in the hands of a leader or small elite. And so most often you'll see it exhibiting through a small elite. And notably, that small group is not constitutionally responsible to the body of people that they are governing. And so that's a very stark contrast to our democratic form of government, where the government exists. It's created for the people, and it exists to actually exercise the will of the people, because that's what our elected representatives are supposed to do. They are supposed to represent the will of the people and make sure that it works through our government. That's not the case with an authoritarian government. That small elite they are not constrained by the will of the people. They are not constrained, as we can see here, by any constitutional type of law. So that should be disturbing. That should be disturbing. And so just keep that in mind when we actually get into Aristotle's principles. But now let's talk a little bit about the framework that accompanies an authoritarian government. So I also have 4 criteria of authoritarian governments. And so for the first criteria, we see that elections either do not exist at all, which means that people do not have the right to vote. Because if there's no election, then what do you need to vote for? Okay, so again, that should be a little bit disconcerting or alarming. Even if people do have their right to vote, the election is not seriously contested. Okay, and so I have in parentheses here that electoral competition is either eliminated de jure or de facto. And that means it's either eliminated by law, so you may have an election, but there's only one party running, which means you can only vote for that party. So you really don't have a choice. You're not really exercising your free will when someone tells you, okay, this is who you can vote for, and you go vote for them. So that's an example of electoral competition being eliminated de jure. And then we also have electoral competition being eliminated, de facto eliminated. And that means that from the outside, it may look like you have the right to vote. So you might have an election, and there may be 2 parties in the election, and you may actually have the freedom to go and actually put your vote in for whichever party you decide. But when competition is eliminated in a de facto manner, it doesn't matter who you vote for. The party that is in control is the party that is going to win, irregardless of what the tabulation of the votes say. That is an example of de facto elimination of electoral competition. Keep that in mind as well. So the next criteria that we have is legislatures either do not exist or are thoroughly controlled by the ruling party. So if there's no election, then there's no right to vote. And if there's no right to vote, they don't elect legislatures. So even if there is a legislature, that legislature doesn't actually have any power to run the government or to make laws. So again, that's distinct from in a democracy where we have a legislature that actually exists on the federal and the state level, and that has true authority to make laws, and that actually is the legislature's job, is to create laws. And the third criteria of authoritarian governments is that the authoritarian government will routinely subordinate or co-opt the judiciary. And so we see that their judiciary wasn't even mentioned in the democratic form of government. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist in democracies, it's just not co-opted in a democracy. Democracies, including our United States democracy, does include a judicial branch. However, it is an independent branch of the government. It is not co-opted or subordinated to the president, and it should not be. And it is not co-opted or subordinated to the legislature, and it should not be. So now, lastly, the last criteria of authoritarian governments is that the media is either entirely state-owned or heavily censored or systematically repressed, which means that either the media is either entirely state-owned, or even if it's not entirely state-owned, it is not independent like it is in our United States democracy. And so again, you'll see that in our democratic criteria or democratic framework, there was no mention of the press. And the reason being is that in a democracy, you have freedom of the press and you have freedom of speech. But in an authoritarian regime or government, you don't have that. It's actually the government is going to control what you get to hear, what you get to see in the media. All right. So that's a very broad overview of the 4 criteria of democratic governments and the 4 criteria of authoritarian governments. Then I do want to just talk very quickly about what is a tyranny. And a tyranny is a different type of government. The only reason that I want to mention a tyranny is because we are, in part 2 of this segment, we are going to be discussing Aristotle's theory on democracy. And Aristotle is an ancient Greek philosopher. He was born before Jesus was born, before Christ. So, when you see dates, and some dates will say BC, that means before Christ. We are now in 2022 AD. That means that Aristotle actually formulated his theory more than 2,000 or years ago, okay? So, at the time when Aristotle proposed his theory, he was discussing a tyranny. Now, today, there are other types of governments between democracies and tyrannies, where we see this authoritarian type of government come in. It is a transitional type of government. So for people who are familiar with Aristotle's work, I am slightly modifying the theory to be more, to apply to a more common day situation, something that is more likely to occur in today's legal climate. But again, I did want to, for that reason, I did just want to at least touch upon the tyranny. And again, now there was a definition of tyranny in Black's Law's dictionary, and so I have provided it. So here I am summarizing the difference between democratic and authoritarian types of governments. And again, we see that the underlying theme of democratic forms of government is freedom. And so here I'm just giving a very quick overview of the three different types of governments that I have discussed. So we see that in a democracy, we have rule by the many. So if we look at the bottom here, we have rule by the many, and that means equals you have a democracy. Then we have an authoritarian form of government, which is rule by the few, and that now we have come to the point where we can discuss Aristotle's theory on how democracies deteriorate into authoritarian or tyrannical types of governments. And so if you thought this was interesting, then definitely stay tuned for part 2, where we discuss some of these factors right here. And I'll provide some present day examples, and we are then now going to analyze whether our democracy is in danger of deteriorating into some other type of government, but specifically we are going to analyze whether it's in danger of or may even appear to be deteriorating into an authoritarian type of government. Well, again, if this is something that you're interested in, go ahead and stay tuned for my next episode. If you have any questions, or comments, go ahead and leave them in the comments section below. And I'll see you in our next episode.